By the Carboniferous, many different kinds of large and complex plants had evolved. Giant club mosses trees dominated the coal swamps. Tree ferns and giant horsetails, as well as several groups of primitive seed plants, grew on riverbanks and in drier areas. Carboniferous plants reached levels of structural diversity and biological sophistication well beyond that of their Devonian precursors. Tree-like forms developed in several groups. There were also herbaceous plants, as well as scramblers and climbers. Carboniferous plants formed new and more complex ecosystems. Several different groups of seed plants are recognized for the first time during the Carboniferous. Lignopterids had fern-like leaves and generally produced relatively small seeds, similar to those of the earliest seed plants from the Devonian. As in these very early seed plants, the pollen grains of Lignopterids were indistinguishable from the spores of primitive euphylophytes. Meduiosans were generally larger plants, often with large, fern-like leaves. They had unusually large pollen grains and some also produced very large seeds. Chordate, which may be closely related to living conifers, had strap-shaped leaves with parallel veins. They produced small seeds and, like conifers, their pollen grains had either one or two attached air sacs, which would have given them additional buoyancy both in air and in fluids. They may have had a pollination system similar to that of living conifers. Some chordate were trees, while others were scrambling plants. None of these Carboniferous seed plants appears to have produced seeds that could remain dormant for long periods. Giant lycopods, such as Lepidodendron and Lepidophlorios, dominated the tropical coal swamps of eastern North America and Europe during the Carboniferous. These remarkable plants grew in a very strange way, quite unlike that of any living tree. They also reproduced in several different ways. The coal swamps, and the strange plants that inhabited them, declined in importance towards the end of the Carboniferous as the wet tropical conditions in which they flourished gradually became increasingly restricted. Oncolites are fossilized structures created by cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. These microorganisms need light to grow, and they typically live in warm shallow sea water, where they encrust hard objects such as pieces of shell. They secrete mucus and calcium carbonate. As this sediment accumulates around them, they migrate to the outside to stay in the light. Over time, this creates a layered structure with a rounded outline. Only a few cells thick when alive, tholites is often little more than a film of carbon when fossilized. Precise identification is often uncertain. Some tholite specimens are probably algae, while others are liverworts. Liverworts are among the simplest of land plants and do not have roots, stems or leaves. Their plant body, a flat green ribbon known as a thallus, clings to solid surfaces by tiny hairs or rhizoids, and spreads by branching into two. Plants this simple do not have an internal system for moving water, so they need to live in damp habitats. With its bark and towering trunk, Lepidodendron is one of the most famous of all prehistoric plants. A giant club moss, its fossils show many features linking it with its smaller relatives from Devonian times. Its narrow leaves were spirally arranged and it reproduced by forming spores inside cones. It spent half of its life as a branchless pole that emerged from the forest floor. As it reached maturity, its upward growth slowed, and branches appeared. Finally, cones formed at the branch tips, and upward growth stopped, as the plant put all its energy into making and shedding spores. In some species, the tree died once this task was complete. Like Lepidodendron, Sigillaria is known first and foremost for its fossilized bark. In one of the most common forms, this looks like an embossed replica of a honeycomb, with six-sided cells arranged with almost mathematical precision. Each cell, or scar, marks the position of a leaf cushion, each of which bore a single grass-like leaf. As the tree grew, the oldest leaves were shed, to be replaced by new ones growing higher up the trunk. As a young plant, Sigillaria echoed Lepidodendron's growth pattern. But as they reached canopy height, the two trees matured in very different ways. Lepidodendron formed a high crown, with many leafy branches, but Sigillaria forked only once, or occasionally twice, producing limbs that looked like huge bottlebrushes. Like all giant club mosses, it reproduced by forming spores inside cones. Tree-sized club mosses were not the only successful lycophytes during the Carboniferous period. Fossils show that creeping forms, such as Selaginella, also flourished. With its small, spirally arranged leaves of different sizes, and dichotomous, branching growth, Selaginella had a strong resemblance to the low-growing club mosses with the same name that have survived to the present day. Selaginella is a relatively rare fossil, and the earliest specimens have been dated to the early Carboniferous. In Coal Age rocks, shoots of Selaginella should not be confused with the tips of branches from giant club mosses. Bearing a striking resemblance to a snake's skin, this fossilized bark comes from a giant club mosses that lived at the same time as Lepidodendron. Although not as tall as its more famous relative, Lepidoploios was just as widespread. It grew in peat-rich forests rather than muddy estuarine swamps. Lepidoploios produced the largest spores of any primitive vascular plant, and these were probably fertilized aquatically following dispersal. This name is used for the fossilized cones of Sphenophyllum. These soft cones formed on short, fertile shoots, with up to 20 closely set whorls of bracts, or sporangium-bearing leaves. The spores were microscopic, and a single cone could produce the gamete-forming bod, which, in turn, produced male and female cells. Then, once fertilization occurred, a new spore-forming plant started to grow. During the Carboniferous period, not all horsetails evolved into tree-like forms. Some, including Sphenophyllum, were low-growing or climbing plants that lived in damp places and on forest floors. Despite being soft-stemmed, they were ideally placed to form fossils, and their preserved remains are common in Coal Age rocks all over the world. Sphenophyllum's leaves were arranged in whorls, but they had a wide variety of shapes. Once the name given to its fossils, but now commonly used for the whole plant, Calamites was a conspicuous, bushy tree of Carboniferous swamps. Calamites had the typical horsetail outline, with a ridged stem divided into jointed segments, carrying branches and leaves arranged in circular whorls. Mature specimens could reach heights of 20 meters with stems over 60 centimeters across. With its 3 meters long fronds and elegantly flaring trunk, Ceronius would have been one of the most graceful ferns of Carboniferous times. Like today's tree ferns, it had a single, unbranched trunk, topped by an arching crown of fronds that uncoiled as they grew. The trunk grew differently from those of most other trees. Its core was made of a mass of woody segments, surrounded by thick, fibrous roots that ran down from higher on the trunk. This jacket of roots worked like wood, thickening as the tree gained height. The name Ceronius was originally applied to these fossilized stems, but has since been used for the entire plant. Ceronius seems to have grown in a wide variety of habitats, from wet low-lying ground to much drier environments. Sphenopterous foliage grew on two distinct kinds of plants. Some grew on ferns, where the fronds produced spores, but most belonged to seed plants with fern-like leaves. One of the best known of these primitive seed plants is Ligonopterous oldemia, which comes from Carboniferous rocks in Britain. It was covered with tiny club-shaped glands, distinguishing it from all other prehistoric plants. Ligonopterous has an important place in botanical history. Its discovery, made in the early 1900s, proved the existence of previously unrecognized groups of extinct seed plants. During the Carboniferous period, many plants evolved finely divided fronds, and Zearias were some of the most delicate. Zearia grew in shady, swampy ground. It produced spores on the underside of its leaves, but it may also have spread by shedding specialized leaflets, which would then have taken root. This way of growing is used today by some ferns with highly divided fronds, particularly in wet habitats. With seeds as big as eggs, Medulosa is one of the most intriguing plants of the Carboniferous. Unlike most other seed plants, it combined fern-like foliage with a seed-forming lifestyle, although it did not grow flowers. It grew by producing new fronds at the tip of its stem while the oldest fell away. To reproduce, it formed large seeds and huge numbers of unusually large pollen grains. The grains would have been too heavy to drift far in the wind. Instead, it has been suggested that insects may have carried them between plants, in an early example of the partnership that was to become so important to flowering plants. Medullosans produced their pollen in specialized organs that hung from their leaves. Many of these, including Petonia, are known from fossils. They grew in a wide variety of shapes, from simple branching structures to objects that look like figs or showerheads several inches wide. All had the same function, to disperse pollen efficiently so that seeds could be formed. The pollen-producing organs are often found in isolation, which makes it hard to link them to particular parent plants. Medullosans were not the largest plants in the Carboniferous period, but their leaves are some of the most common fossils from that time. Macroneuropterus is the name given for one particular form of their foliage, which includes some of the earliest known leaves. In Macroneuropterus foliage, the leaflets have heart-shaped bases and are only attached by their stalks, rather than by their blades. They have a fine tracery of spreading veins. With their rounded outlines, these isolated leaflets look like tiny shells, but they have veins that radiate out like the ribs of a fan. Several kinds of medullosans seem to have produced Cyclopterous leaflets. One theory is that these leaflets grew on young plants, in the dim light of the forest floor. Once the plant had grown taller, it produced more typical, fern-like fronds. Another theory is that the rounded leaflets protected the rest of the frond as it uncoiled. Compared to ferns, medullosans were robust plants with strong stems and a crown of large leaves. Elaeithopterous leaves were the largest of all. One specimen, found in coal mine in northern France, was nearly 7.5 meters long and 2 meters wide, making it one of the largest leaves ever discovered from Paleozoic times. Elaeithopterous leaflets could be up to 5 centimeters long, and they typically flared out near the stem. Leaves on this type were produced by Medullosa and its relatives. The tough leaf bases merged to form strong, woody stems. At certain times of the year, the leaves would have been weighed down by a crop of developing seeds. Meaning beautiful fern, Calodiridium foliage was strikingly convex when seen from above. Individually, Calodiridium fossils are often less than 15 centimeters long, but in life, the leaves could be 20 times that length, subdividing 3 or 4 times. Their leaflets were attached by broad bases, and had a deeply sunken midvein. Like most fossil leaves, Calodiridium are almost always found detached from their parent plant, and unlike the fronds of true ferns, none of them shows structures for making spores. Instead, at least 2 species have been found with ovules, showing that they were grown by seed ferns or pteridosperms. Compared to fern fronds, the leaves of seed plant fronds had a tough outer cuticle or skin. This made them more resistant to dry conditions, and increased their chances of forming fossils. Usually found as isolated fragments, Meryopterous foliage belonged to a collection of climbing forms of seed plant, which grew up other plants in their quest for light. These plants had narrow, pliable stems, and many of them also had grappling hooks on the ends of their leaflets, in some cases up to 4 centimeters long. Meryopterous fronds also had long, bare stalks between the leaflets, the ideal shape for locking the plant in place once the frond had fully formed. Fossils show that the remainder of the leaf was divided into 4 roughly equal parts, an unusual feature that helps identify this group of plants. Over 1,000 different seed plant leaves have been identified from fossil foliage, the majority coming from coal-age rocks. Odontopterus is one of the most common types. Most of these fronds were less than 1 meter long, and were attached to plants with medullosa stems. However, these plants were much smaller in size than the medullosa trees, and would have scrambled through low-growing vegetation, or used the larger trees for support. They were common in both swamps and on drier ground, especially toward the end of the Carboniferous. With their 2 matching ranks of leaflets, plagiosomites could easily be mistaken for the leaf of a cycad. However, this kind of foliage was also produced by Nogarathialenes, a group of extinct plants that have proved difficult to classify. Nogarathialenes have been linked to horsetails and to ferns, but recent research suggests that they were more closely allied to progymnosperms. Named after the German geologist Johann Jacob Noegerth, this plant was first identified in the 1820s form its distinctive compound leaves. Each one has 2 rows of leaflets, arranged alternately or in opposites pairs, creating a frond up to 30 centimeters long. The leaves are thought to have grown on a short trunk, and may have been tough and leathery despite their fragile appearance. More than a dozen species of Eutrechtia have been identified from fossilized twigs. A tree with a slender trunk, its branches were arranged in widely spaced whorls and were covered with a spiral of small needles. These were flanked by short shoots that created a spreading, feathery outline. Like other early conifers, Eutrechtia lived in dry ground rather than the low-lying swamps of Carboniferous times. The name Walchia is used for foliage of this type in which preservation of detail is insufficient to enable accurate assignment to an extinct family. Walchan conifers were common forest trees in the late Carboniferous period. They had a straight, upright trunk, with leafy branches growing out in horizontal tiers. Each branch was covered with needle-like leaves, just a fraction of 30 centimeters long. Conifers became more widespread toward the end of the Coal Age, as the global climate dried. The Chordate were a major group of plants that shared many features with conifers. They had woody stems and produced seeds in cones, but instead of scales or needles, they grew strap-shaped leaves up to 1 meter long. Their male and female cones grew on separate branches, and they often produced heart-shaped seeds. As a group, Chordate grew in a wide range of habitats. Many were low-growing shrubs, but they also included towering, tropical trees that could reach heights of 45 meters. The drying climates of the Permian finally destroyed the ancient coal swamps that were characteristic of the Carboniferous. This led to the extinction of many characteristic Carboniferous plants. However, new kinds of habitats provided fresh opportunities for the expansion of other plant lineages. During the Permian, the giant tree lycopods and the habitats in which they thrived declined and eventually disappeared. Medullosans, Chordate, and many other groups of archaic plants also became extinct during the Permian. However, conifers and other new kinds of plants diversified and set the stage for further evolutionary innovation through the Mesozoic. Several new groups of seed plants appeared during the Permian. Most are quite poorly understood, but glossopterids are one of the better known of these groups. They are characteristic of areas that were once at high latitudes in the southern hemisphere. Recognition of their distinctive leaves in Australia, South America and Antarctica was important early evidence for continental drift. Cycads also made their first appearance in the Permian and subsequently became important in the Mesozoic. Several groups of poorly understood Permian seed plants may be early relatives of these true cycads. In China, an enigmatic group called Gigantopterids are especially interesting. Gigantopterids had large leaves with specialized net venation very similar to that seen in angiosperms. Some of these Gigantopterids were probably climbers in Permian equatorial forests. The earliest conifers are from the late Carboniferous. They had normal, conifer-like leafy shoots, but their cones were much less compact than those of any modern conifer. The cones of early conifers have been compared to the cones of Chordate. The early conifers of the Carboniferous occurred in drier environments outside the lowland coal swamps, and as the climate dried in the Permian, conifers and other groups from these areas became more important. Conifers may also have been the first seed plants in which the seed could remain dormant prior to germination. This ground-hugging fern is similar to a family of living ferns that are mainly found in the tropics. Known as forking ferns, they have fronds that grow in pairs, and creeping rhizomes or underground stems. Like all ferns, oligocarpia spread from place to place by spores, which developed on the undersides of its fronds. However, recent fossil finds show that its rhizomes may have been just as important, allowing it to invade new areas of ground in the way that bracken does today. Unusual for a prehistoric species, these fossils also show the same plant at many different stages of development. These include adult ferns, and tiny plantlets with minute rows TTES of leaves. Protoblechnum fronds have broad, webbed leaflets, a feature found in some living hard ferns or deer ferns of the genus Blechnum, which gives this type of foliage its scientific name. However, instead of belonging to ferns, Protoblechnum fronds belong to a group of plants called peltosperms. Most of these plants were shrubs or small trees. They grew in a variety of habitats, but their foliage would have made them particularly well adapted to areas with an annual dry season, such as subtropical river plains. Tubicolous fossils are the preserved trunks of an ancient group of ferns, dating back over 300 million years. In cross-section, the fossils show a dense mass of stems embedded in a matrix of roots. Each stem is enclosed by an oval sheath and contains a C-shaped stalk. Tuberculous ferns were upright or scrambling, anchoring themselves with roots that grew from the stems near the base of their leaves. Most lived on shady swamp floors, but some species may have grown high up on trees to collect light. Since its discovery in 1828, by French paleobotanist Adolphe Brongniart, Glossopteris has become one of the most studied prehistoric plants. The Glossopteris fossils were found in India, but others have been unearthed in all the land masses of the southern hemisphere. Glossopteris means tongue fern, which describes its leaf shape. Dozens of species have been identified, most being shrubs or small trees. Despite its name, Glossopteris reproduced by seed, not spores, which developed in stalked organs attached to the leaves. Belonging to the same group of seed ferns as Protoblechnum, calotarids are well known from fossils of their leaves and seed-producing organs. Their leaves were up to 1 meter long. In addition to having leaf segments arranged in opposite pairs, they often had small leaflets attached to the central midrib. Calotaris bore its seeds on the underside of fan-shaped scales, which were arranged in a spiral around a vertical stalk. The gigantotarids are an enigmatic group of plants, known mainly from fossils found in Asia and North America. They had woody stems, sometimes with spines, and many had leaves like those of flowering plants. They died out in the early Triassic, and little is known about how they reproduced, which makes it hard to judge exactly where they fit in plant evolution. This foliage belonged to fern-like plants that reproduced by growing spores. In Tingia elegans, the leaves bore leaflets in 4 rows, the 2 rows on the upper surface were largest, masking the smaller ones underneath. The plant's cones were attached at the base of the leaves. As fossils, Nogarathialenes are relatively rare, although cones and leaves have been found together, showing that they came from the same plant. They appeared in the late Carboniferous and became extinct during the Triassic. Although they show links with progymnosperms, their place in plant evolution is not clear. From the Triassic onward, many fossils show how ginkgos evolved variations of fan-shaped leaves. Earlier fossils are far rarer. Sigmophyllum may have been an ancient forerunner of living ginkgo, since its leaves superficially have the classic ginkgo outline. However, this resemblance is probably misleading. No fossils have been found of its fruits or seeds, which makes it likely that the leaves come from a more primitive plant. Conifers first appeared in the Carboniferous Perioden, but they became more widespread during the Permian, with its cooler, dry, global climate. Ulmania was one of these Permian conifers, with narrow, widely spreading leaves. Its male cones produced pollen grains that had a microscopic, wing-like sac to help them drift on the wind. Like most conifers, its seed-bearing cones were woody, measuring up to 6 centimeters long. The seeds developed on the upper surface of rounded scales.